This is Long Listen, where great books aren't consumed, they're examined. Each episode explores the psychology, philosophy, and hidden tensions inside influential works, helping you move beyond quotes and headlines into the deeper insights that actually change perspective. Most people meet The Prince the wrong way. They hear it's a dark book, a manual for manipulation, or worse, a guide for becoming a cold-blooded villain. Scroll YouTube or TikTok, and you'll see Machiavelli packaged as the godfather of toxic power plays, the original Sigma mastermind. But what if I told you that this framing says more about our fear of reality than about the book itself? Think about pop culture for a second. Shows like House of Cards or Game of Thrones have trained us to associate Machiavellian thinking with backstabbing, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. Frank Underwood breaking the fourth wall, Littlefinger whispering in the shadows. These characters feel like Machiavelli in human form, and that's why so many creators present The Prince as a villain's playbook. But here's the twist. Machiavelli wasn't writing a fantasy about evil geniuses. He was writing a survival guide for a world already on fire. That difference matters, especially if you're young. Because when creators reduce The Prince to how to manipulate people, the audience splits into two predictable camps. One side thinks, wow, this is brutally honest. Finally, someone tells the truth. The other side recoils. This is immoral, cynical, and dangerous. Both reactions miss the core question Machiavelli was actually asking. He wasn't asking, how do I become powerful at all costs? He was asking, how does power really work when ideals collapse? To understand why this book feels so uncomfortable, we have to rewind, not just intellectually, but emotionally. Rewind to 16th century Italy, where loyalty expired faster than modern TikTok trends and alliances flipped overnight. Florence, Machiavelli's home, wasn't a stable nation with clear rules. It was a pressure cooker of wars, invasions, betrayals, and political purges. Governments fell, families rose and disappeared, and moral purity didn't protect anyone from exile or execution. Machiavelli himself lost his job, his status, and his future almost overnight. This book wasn't written from a throne. It was written from the sidelines, by someone who had watched idealists fail again and again. That's why The Prince doesn't sound comforting. It doesn't try to tell you how the world should be. It forces you to look at how the world actually behaves when power is at stake. Most creators stop at the shock value. The famous lines about fear over love, deception over honesty, because outrage gets clicks. But Machiavelli's real provocation is quieter and more disturbing. What if morality alone is not enough to survive reality? For a young audience, this hits a nerve. We grow up hearing, be yourself, be kind, do the right thing, and then we enter systems, workplaces, institutions, even social media, that don't reward purity, but perception, leverage, and timing. The Prince doesn't tell you to abandon your values. It warns you what happens when you assume everyone else shares them. And that's why the book keeps coming back, century after century, refusing to stay buried as a bad book. So before we judge Machiavelli as a monster or idolize him as a genius manipulator, we need to slow down. This isn't a book about becoming evil. It's a book about waking up. And once you see it that way, The Prince becomes far more relevant and far more unsettling than most creators are willing to admit. To really get The Prince, you have to stop imagining Machiavelli as some dark genius pulling strings from the shadows. He wasn't a king, a general, or a billionaire power broker. He was an underdog who lost almost everything, and that context changes how every sentence in this book should be read. Nicollò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, not into nobility, but into a modest family with good education and zero political immunity. He rose through intelligence, not bloodline, landing a role as a civil servant and diplomat for the Florentine Republic. For years, he traveled across Europe, negotiating with kings, observing generals, and watching power up close, not from the throne, but from the waiting room. This mattered because Machiavelli didn't study power in theory. He watched it fail, succeed, and betray people in real time. Then everything collapsed. The Medici family returned to power in Florence, the Republic fell, and Machiavelli was suddenly on the wrong side of history. He lost his job overnight, was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, tortured, and eventually exiled from political life. Imagine waking up one day and realizing your entire career, network, and identity are gone. Not because you were incompetent, but because the political algorithm changed. Machiavelli didn't just lose power, he lost relevance. This is where The Prince begins to look less like a villain's manifesto and more like a desperate strategic reset. In modern terms, Machiavelli is basically a failed startup founder who got crushed by market forces, then went home and wrote the most brutally honest blog post imaginable for potential investors. The Prince was his CV. It was his way of saying, I understand how this world really works. Put me back in the game. And that's important, because the book isn't written from a place of arrogance, it's written from survival. When creators gloss over this, they miss the emotional engine of the book. Machiavelli wasn't fantasizing about cruelty. He was diagnosing instability. Italy at the time wasn't just chaotic. It was violently unpredictable. City-states fought constantly. Alliances shifted without warning. Mercenaries switched sides mid-war. Leaders who trusted promises over preparation didn't just fail. They died. In a world like that, moral purity wasn't a shield. It was a liability. That's why The Prince reads the way it does. It doesn't waste time on ideals, because ideals weren't keeping anyone alive. Instead, Machiavelli focuses on patterns. What works, what collapses, what repeats. Think of the book less as a moral lecture and more as an app, a GPS for navigating chaos. A GPS doesn't judge where you're going. It tells you where the road actually is. And Machiavelli's Italy was a terrain full of potholes, ambushes, and dead ends. This is where many creators get it wrong. They treat The Prince like a map to hell. A set of instructions that turn you into a manipulative monster. But Machiavelli isn't saying, this is who you should be. He's saying, this is what the world does to people who ignore reality. The book doesn't create cruelty. It reveals the cost of pretending cruelty doesn't exist. And here's where it becomes relevant to young people today. We live in a world that looks stable on the surface, but shifts fast underneath. Algorithms change, careers collapse, platforms rise and fall. One viral moment can make or break someone's future. The systems we move through don't reward intention. They reward adaptation. Machiavelli saw the same thing in political form. The only difference is the scale and the tools. That's why The Prince isn't obsessed with being good, but with being effective. Not because goodness is useless, but because effectiveness determines whether you even get the chance to practice goodness. You can't influence a system you don't survive. This is an uncomfortable idea, and it's why the book keeps getting reduced to edgy quotes instead of understood as a whole. What Machiavelli offers is not cynicism, but clarity. He strips away comforting lies about power and replaces them with something colder, but more useful: awareness. In chaos, the worst mistake isn't being immoral, it's being naive. And naivety, in Machiavelli's world, wasn't punished with bad vibes. It was punished with exile, torture, or death. So when you read The Prince through the lens of Machiavelli's life, the tone shifts. This isn't a celebration of ruthlessness. It's the voice of someone who's seen what happens when leaders rely on hope instead of preparation, trust instead of structure, ideals instead of leverage. It's not a love letter to power, it's a warning label. And that's the key difference between Machiavelli and the way he's often portrayed online. He wasn't trying to turn people into villains. He was trying to help them navigate a world that already was. Once you strip away the shock quotes and the historical drama, the Prince really boils down to a few uncomfortable truths about human behavior. And uncomfortable is the right word, because these ideas clash hard with how most of us want to see ourselves and the world. Machiavelli isn't interested in how humans behave on their best days. He's interested in how they behave when incentives shift, pressure rises, and consequences disappear. For young people navigating social media, careers, and relationships, this is where the book suddenly feels less ancient and more disturbingly familiar. The first truth Machiavelli insists on is simple and brutal. People are not as good as you hope they are. Not evil, necessarily, just inconsistent, self-interested, and deeply influenced by circumstance. Loyalty, gratitude, and morality exist, but they are fragile. They last only as long as they're convenient. Machiavelli observed this in politics, but the same pattern plays out daily on your phone. Think about social media. You follow an influencer because they inspire you, motivate you, or feel authentic. Their fan base feels loyal, almost tribal. But the moment the algorithm shifts or the sponsors disappear, the engagement drops. Fans move on. What looked like loyalty was often just alignment of interest. Machiavelli would nod at this and say, "This is human nature, not betrayal." Or take dating apps. People talk about loyalty and connection, but the structure of the system rewards optionality. Swipe right today, ghost tomorrow. Promises feel sincere in the moment, but they dissolve the second a better option appears. Machiavelli's insight isn't that people are cruel. It's that commitment weakens when consequences are low. He wasn't judging this behavior. He was warning leaders not to build systems that rely on fragile virtues alone. This is why Machiavelli says, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Not because fear is noble, but because fear is predictable. Love depends on emotion, fear depends on structure. And in chaotic environments, predictability matters more than purity. The mistake isn't believing in goodness. The mistake is assuming goodness will survive pressure without reinforcement. The second truth Machiavelli delivers hits even closer to home for Gen Z. Image matters more than essence. Not because essence is meaningless, but because essence is invisible. People don't experience your intentions, they experience your signals. Machiavelli understood that leaders don't rule based on who they truly are, but on who they appear to be. And this idea feels almost obvious in the age of Instagram, LinkedIn, and personal branding. Think about how careers are built now. You can be incredibly competent, intelligent, and hardworking, but if no one sees it, it might as well not exist. Meanwhile, someone with half the skill but a strong narrative can dominate attention. This isn't fake. It's strategic visibility. Machiavelli never argued that leaders should be empty inside. He argued that being virtuous without being seen as virtuous is politically useless. Look at Elon Musk. Every tweet, every public gesture reinforces the image of the genius rebel. Whether you admire him or not, the lesson is clear. His power comes less from what he knows and more from what people believe he represents. Machiavelli would say this isn't manipulation. It's understanding perception as a force. For young people, this raises an uncomfortable question. Are we being authentic, or are we being invisible? Machiavelli's answer would probably disappoint both extremes. He wouldn't tell you to fake a personality, but he would tell you that authenticity without strategy is just self-expression, not influence. Image is the interface between your inner world and the social system. Ignore it, and the system will ignore you back. The third truth Machiavelli offers might be the hardest to accept, especially for people raised on cooperation and kindness. Goodness that is not protected becomes a weakness. This doesn't mean kindness is bad. It means kindness without boundaries invites exploitation. Machiavelli saw this repeatedly in leaders who wanted to be loved at all costs and ended up being overthrown, betrayed, or erased. Translate this into a modern, painfully relatable scenario. The group project in university. There's always one person who's nice, flexible, never complains, always picks up the slack. At first, they're appreciated. Over time, they become expected. Eventually, they're exploited. Machiavelli would say the problem isn't kindness, it's the absence of limits. Or think of it like social media privacy. If your account is public, anyone can access it. That doesn't mean people will respect it. Setting boundaries isn't aggression, it's architecture. Being kind without boundaries is like leaving your front door open and hoping no one walks in. Machiavelli's advice here isn't to harden your heart, but to structure your generosity so it doesn't destroy you. This is where the prince often gets misread as promoting cruelty. But Machiavelli doesn't celebrate exploitation. He warns against being easy to exploit. He's not saying, don't be good. He's saying, don't confuse goodness with safety. Safety comes from systems, consequences, and clarity. What connects all three truths is a single idea. Humans adapt to incentives. Change the environment, and behavior changes with it. Loyalty, honesty, and kindness are not fixed traits. They're responses to context. Machiavelli forces us to stop romanticizing human nature and start designing around it. For a young audience, this can feel disillusioning. It clashes with the desire to believe that being nice, real, and well-intentioned is enough. But Machiavelli isn't trying to make you cynical. He's trying to make you resilient. Naivety feels moral, but it's often just untested optimism. The real danger of the prince isn't that people will apply it everywhere. It's that they won't understand when not to apply it. Machiavelli's insights are meant for unstable systems, competitive environments, and power-driven dynamics. Not friendships, love, or intimacy. Knowing when to switch frameworks is the real maturity. And this is why the prince still matters. Not as a guide to domination, but as a mirror. It reflects the parts of human behavior we prefer to ignore, until ignoring them costs us something. For young people growing up in fast-moving, reputation-based systems, Machiavelli isn't teaching you how to win at life. He's teaching you how not to lose yourself by misunderstanding the game you're already playing. Up to this point, The Prince might still sound like a book meant for kings, CEOs, or people who already sit on top of some invisible hierarchy. But here's the twist that most creators completely miss. You don't need power to be affected by power. In fact, the people who suffer the most are often the ones who don't understand how power works at all. This is where Machiavelli becomes surprisingly useful for young people. Not as a manual for domination, but as a detection system. Think of the prince less as a guide for becoming the boss, and more as a way to stop being quietly controlled. You don't need to be the prince to be inside someone else's kingdom. Workplaces, friend groups, relationships, and online platforms all have power dynamics, just scaled down, disguised, and normalized. Let's start with work. Early in your career, especially in your 20s, you're often told to be grateful. Grateful for the opportunity, grateful for the experience, grateful for the learning curve. And sometimes that gratitude is real, but sometimes it becomes leverage. A boss reminds you how they gave you a chance, how they went out of their way to help you, and suddenly staying late, taking on extra tasks, or postponing your raise feels like a moral obligation. This is what Machiavelli would recognize as power built on debt. Not financial debt, emotional debt. The dangerous part isn't the favor itself, it's the unspoken expectation attached to it. Machiavelli would say, when gratitude replaces clear contracts, power becomes asymmetrical. The moment you recognize this, the dynamic changes. Understanding Machiavelli doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you capable of negotiating without guilt. You stop thinking in terms of, I owe them, and start thinking in terms of value, contribution, and boundaries. That's not cold. That's an adult. Now zoom out to something even more relatable. Friend groups. Every group has its informal hierarchy, even when everyone insists it's chill. Sometimes power doesn't come from charisma or confidence, but from information. Someone always knows the drama first. Someone always controls the narrative. Someone drops harmless gossip that subtly shifts how others are perceived. Machiavelli would immediately spot this as soft power. Not domination through force, but influence through reputation. In group chats, gossip functions like currency. It decides who's in, who's out, who's trusted, and who's slowly isolated. If you don't understand this, you might think conflicts appear out of nowhere. Machiavelli teaches you to watch patterns instead of stories. Who benefits when a rumor spreads? Who gains influence when someone else's image collapses? You don't need to confront the manipulator. Just recognizing the game already protects you. Then there's romantic relationships, where Machiavelli's insights feel almost uncomfortably accurate. Love is supposed to be safe, but power sneaks in through fear. Fear of loss. Fear of being alone. Fear of not being enough. Some partners, consciously or not, learn to weaponize this. They pull away to make you anxious. They hint at alternatives. They remind you subtly that you're replaceable. Machiavelli would describe this as control through uncertainty. This is where the prince becomes a red flag radar. Not because it tells you to manipulate back, but because it teaches you to recognize when affection turns into leverage. Love based on fear isn't stability, it's dependence. And dependence always benefits one side more than the other. Spotting this early doesn't make you cynical. It saves you time, energy, and self-respect. Social media is perhaps where Machiavelli feels the most modern. Platforms reward strong images, clear narratives, and emotional reactions. Nuance doesn't go viral. Confidence does. Outrage travels faster than explanation. The algorithm doesn't care if you're right. It cares if you're visible. Machiavelli understood this long before the internet existed. Perception creates reality, not the other way around. This is why cancel culture feels so brutal. Once an image collapses, the truth often doesn't matter anymore. The crowd moves on. Machiavelli would say, this isn't cruelty, it's momentum. Understanding this doesn't mean you approve of it. It means you stop being surprised by it. Knowing how image works helps you protect yourself from trolls, pile-ons, and performative outrage. And here's where the fun analogy comes in. Because Machiavelli isn't just serious and grim. Think of the prince as a cheat code in a social game. Like Among Us. Most players focus on tasks, vibes, and trust. But the game isn't won by being nice. It's won by detecting patterns. Who speaks at the right moment? Who deflects blame? Who creates confusion when they're under suspicion? Machiavelli teaches you how to spot imposters without needing to be the leader. You don't need authority to observe. You don't need power to notice inconsistency. In fact, being powerless sometimes makes you more perceptive. Machiavelli sharpens your awareness, not your aggression. It's not about accusing everyone. It's about not blindly trusting appearances. This is what makes The Prince so misunderstood. People assume it turns readers into manipulators. In reality, it turns readers into analysts. It trains you to separate words from incentives, promises from structures, kindness from accountability. You stop asking, "What did they say?" and start asking, "What do they gain?" For young people, this shift is massive. It changes how you move through systems without turning you into a villain. You don't become colder. You become clearer. You stop taking things personally that were never personal to begin with. You stop blaming yourself for dynamics you didn't create. Clarity is not cruelty. It's self-defense. And maybe that's the biggest lie about Machiavelli, that he encourages domination. What he actually offers is literacy, power literacy. The same way financial literacy doesn't make you greedy, and emotional literacy doesn't make you heartless, understanding power doesn't corrupt you. Ignorance does. So when you hear people say, "The prince is dangerous," ask, dangerous to whom? Dangerous to idealism? Maybe? Dangerous to manipulation? Definitely. Because once you see the patterns, they stop working as well, and that's why the prince keeps resurfacing in every era of instability. Not because people want to be villains, but because they're tired of being fooled. If earlier parts of this podcast were about understanding Machiavelli, this part is about using him, quietly, internally, without becoming what you're trying to avoid. You don't need to rule the game. You just need to know the rules. At this point, a fair question starts to surface. Isn't Machiavelli just too cynical? Many philosophers thought so. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously criticized Machiavelli, arguing that the prince corrupts morality and reduces politics to manipulation. From Rousseau's perspective, humans are naturally good, and systems, not people, are what deform us. Reading Machiavelli through that lens, the prince looks like a betrayal of human potential. And honestly, if you read the book in isolation, that criticism makes sense. Machiavelli doesn't sound hopeful. He doesn't appeal to empathy or shared humanity. He talks about fear, deception, and force without apology. But here's the uncomfortable twist. In a post-COVID world flooded with misinformation, performative morality, and algorithmic outrage, Machiavelli doesn't feel outdated. He feels realistic. Rousseau wrote in an era that still believed systems could be redesigned to make people virtuous. Machiavelli wrote in an era where systems collapsed faster than they could be fixed. And today, we live in a hybrid of both. Institutions that promise ethics but reward attention. Platforms that preach community but amplify conflict. In that context, Machiavelli isn't teaching cynicism. He's teaching situational awareness. The real ethical danger isn't Machiavelli himself, it's misapplication. The prince becomes toxic the moment you apply it everywhere. Power logic is not universal logic. Using Machiavelli in intimate spaces is like using a battlefield map to plan a family dinner. You're not being strategic, you're being destructive. Take friendship. Aristotle had a very different view of human relationships. His ethics of friendship are based on mutual goodwill, shared virtue, and long-term trust. In that framework, treating your closest friends as strategic assets is not intelligence. It's betrayal. Machiavelli helps you navigate unstable systems. Aristotle helps you build stable ones. Knowing which lens to use is the real wisdom. The same applies to family. Power games don't create safety there. They erode it. If you start calculating leverage in spaces meant for care, you end up isolated, even if you win. Machiavelli never claimed his ideas should govern all human life. That assumption comes from readers, not the text. The Prince is a tool, not a worldview. A useful modern analogy is cybersecurity. You use a VPN to protect yourself, not to spy on your friends. You learn how phishing scams work so you don't fall for them, not so you can scam others. Understanding exploitation doesn't obligate you to become an exploiter. It gives you immunity. Machiavelli works the same way. This distinction is where many creators fail their audience. They present Machiavelli as either a villain to reject or a mastermind to imitate. Both extremes are lazy. The real value of The Prince is discernment. It teaches you when power logic is active and when it's inappropriate. There's also a deeper moral question hiding underneath all this. Is realism itself immoral? Rousseau would argue that accepting human selfishness normalizes it. Machiavelli would respond that denying it makes you vulnerable. And in the modern world, vulnerability is often exploited at scale, by systems, not individuals. Fake news doesn't succeed because people are evil. It succeeds because incentives reward speed over truth. Machiavelli understood incentives before we had algorithms. The ethical stance that emerges from this isn't cruelty, but responsibility. Once you understand how power works, you're accountable for how you engage with it. You can choose restraint. You can choose transparency, but you can no longer claim ignorance. Machiavelli takes away the comfort of innocence, not the possibility of goodness. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between Machiavelli and his critics. Between realism and idealism. Between survival and meaning. The mistake is thinking you must choose one permanently. Maturity is switching frameworks when the situation demands it. Use Machiavelli when systems are unstable, incentives are misaligned, and power is being exercised without accountability. Use Aristotle when trust, care, and shared values are the goal. Confuse the two, and you either get exploited or become someone you don't recognize. In the end, The Prince doesn't tell you who to be. It tells you what to watch for. And in a world that constantly performs morality while quietly rewarding power, that awareness isn't dangerous. It's necessary. So what do we actually do with The Prince after all this? Do we admire it, fear it, reject it, or secretly apply it? The most honest answer is simpler and more demanding. You read Machiavelli the way you read a map, not a moral commandment. A map doesn't tell you where you should go. It shows you the terrain, the shortcuts, the dead ends, and the danger zones. And once you've seen the map, you can't pretend the landscape doesn't exist. Read The Prince by highlighting patterns, not quotes. Pay attention to how power shows up in your daily news feed. Who controls the narrative? Who benefits when fear spikes? Who gains authority by appearing decisive during chaos? Machiavelli trains your eye to see repetition, and repetition is where power hides. When you stop reacting emotionally and start observing structurally, you become harder to manipulate. Use the book primarily as a detection tool. The Prince is not a weapon. It's an antivirus for the mind. Just like antivirus, software doesn't attack the internet, but protects your system. Machiavelli helps you recognize manipulation before it installs itself in your thinking. When guilt is used as leverage, when fear replaces consent, when image overrides substance, you notice faster. Awareness becomes immunity. But here's the crucial balance. Machiavelli alone is not enough. If you only read The Prince, you risk seeing power everywhere and meaning nowhere. That's why this book works best in combination. Pair it with atomic habits to stay grounded in self-awareness and personal responsibility, so you don't confuse control with growth. Pair it with Sapiens to remember the larger human story, that beneath systems and strategies, we're still a social species searching for belonging and purpose. Machiavelli sharpens your realism. These books restore your humanity. The danger isn't becoming too Machiavellian. The danger is becoming unconsciously Machiavellian, reacting to power without understanding it, absorbing incentives without questioning them. Once you see how the game works, you get to choose how you play, or whether you play at all. That choice is what separates awareness from cynicism. For a young generation growing up inside algorithms, reputations, and invisible hierarchies, the prince isn't a relic, it's a lens. It doesn't make you colder, it makes you clearer. And clarity, when paired with ethics, is one of the rarest forms of power there is. So here's the invitation. Don't read The Prince to become ruthless. Read it to become awake. Use it to spot patterns in politics, work, relationships, and media. Then decide, consciously, where power logic belongs and where it doesn't. Wisdom isn't choosing Machiavelli over morality. It's knowing when each one matters. If this episode helped you see power a little more clearly, share it with someone who's navigating chaos, and let me know. Where have you started noticing Machiavelli in your own life?